according to the Malaysian nationalist narrative, okay, this is the narrative that's peddled in, government-run museums, public schools here and whatnot. The most powerful and commercially significant port, political entity in what is today Malaysia was Malacca. If you look at a map, it's sort of hard to dispute that Malacca isn't at least positioned to be so. It commands the straits that bears its name. These are straits that connect the entire Indian Ocean world with the Pacific world. So we're talking about the connector, the channel through which shipping from Japan, Korea, China, Pacific Southeast Asia, what is today the eastern part of Indonesia, Philippines, Pacific Islands, any shipping from that entire region trying to get to the Indian Ocean, Indian Ocean, Southeast Asia, East Africa, Red Sea, Arabian Sea, that southwestern quadrant of the Muslim world, North Africa. This is the great connector of those two massive worlds. Okay, and Malacca sort of commands that channel. So very, very important strategic geographic position. Still, there were other polities besides Malacca. I'm standing in the territory of one of those polities, the oldest sultanate in what is today Malaysia, the Sultanate of Kedah. There was Johor, there was Aceh, there was Pasai, there was Aru, and many more, including many much smaller polities. But some of these guys were vying with Malacca for #1 status. A Portuguese traveler who spent 3 years in Malacca in the early 1500s, so shortly after the Portuguese had taken it, he described Malacca in this way: "Whoever is Lord of Malacca has his hand on the throat of Venice. As far as from Malacca, and from Malacca to China, and from China to the Moluccas, and from the Moluccas to Java, and from Java to Malacca and Sumatra, all is in our power." Perez knew what he was talking about. Not only did he spend 3 years in Malacca, but he spent considerable time in India, in China, and elsewhere in Southeast Asia as well, Java, Sumatra, and other places. I mean, this guy knew what he was talking about. He literally wrote the book on early trade in the region. It's called Summa Oriental. Summa Oriental provides the first description by a European of what is today Malaysia. And in Summa Oriental, he makes it very clear that Malacca is the critical junction between China and India, and then from India beyond to Europe. A very, very important position, now confirmed by Tomé Perez. Now, unfortunately for Perez, he will never leave Asia alive. He either died as a member of a Portuguese embassy to China, he was either killed there by the Chinese, or he died in China under house arrest, decades of house arrest. But regardless, he provides us with this critical description of Malacca, in many ways confirming at least this aspect of the nationalist narrative. Now, the roots of the great Sultanate at Malacca go back to the 1300s, the late 1300s, and a guy named Parameshvara. Now, who Parameshvara was, this is a subject of debate. Scholars disagree on this question. Some sources say that he was the last king in a long line of legitimate kings of Singapura, what we call Singapore today. Other sources say that he was a Palembang-based merchant prince. In other words, he was from Sumatra. And that because of the threat he'd posed to Majapahit was a great maritime empire based on Java next door. Because of the threat he posed to them, Majapahit drove him out. And so he went to Singapore, usurped the throne of the local chief there, killed him, essentially, and took over for 10 years before being driven out of Singapore again. So who he was he a merchant prince from Sumatra? Was he the last in a long line of Singaporean kings? I don't know. We do know that he was driven out of Singapore, though. Again, there's debate about who drove him out. Was it the Siamese Navy, threatened by his influence in the trade routes and growing control? Was it the Javanese Navy? Was it Majapahit again, driving the same guy out that they'd already driven out from Palembang? Was it someone else? Was it the people of the wife of the guy that he'd assassinated, whose throne he'd usurped from what is today southern Thailand, the Patani Kingdom? Was it them? No one's quite sure. But we do know that he was driven out. And in 1402, he set up shop again, a little further up the west coast of the Malay Peninsula there, on the mouth of the Bertum River. There was a small fishing village. He set up his new trade depot there. This would become Malacca. The critical moment came the next year, though, when a fleet showed up on the horizon from China, dispatched from fledgling Ming China. And Parameshvara, knowing a good opportunity when he saw one, basically rushed out to greet them, quickly offered his tribute, And in return, the Chinese offered Parameshvara protection and other gifts, silks and things, but protection, that was the key. And to cement that relationship, Parameshvara and his whole family and several hundred others in his royal retinue traveled with the very famous Zheng He to the Chinese court, met with the Yongle Emperor, and received, official recognition as the rightful ruler of Malacca. Malacca received official recognition as a Chinese protectorate, and those old threats, the threats from Java, the threats from Siam, those temporarily went away with the promise of Chinese protection. And thus Malacca became a major stopping point for Chinese ships. But it quickly developed into more than that. Pretty soon there were merchants from Java, from Burma, from all over the Indonesian archipelago, from India and all over India, from Arabia and beyond, in Malacca, using Malacca. It was said that 80 languages were spoken on the streets of Malacca. 1,000 merchants lived part-time in Malacca from Gujarat alone. Of course, a good deal of that merchant activity is going to be expropriated by the Malaccan state to enrich the royal family and those who are connected to it, as well as those entrusted, in the pockets of those entrusted to collect the taxation. But be that as it may, at some point, the rulers of Malacca converted to Islam. And again, historically, there's a debate. Who converted to Islam? When did this happen? And why? The tradition here, if you look at the statues and monuments here, Parameshvara is credited with converting to Islam. Parameshvara himself, the very first Sultan of Malacca. Well, other scholars say actually it was his son, in his son's old age, Megat Iskandar Shah. He was the first to convert to Islam. And still others point to later rulers. But whatever the case, it's easy to see that if it was Parameshvara's son, Megat Iskandar Shah, who converted to Islam, it's easy to see why this would make practical sense. I'm not saying I can't get into his head and his heart and say if he converted or not, but practically speaking, it makes sense to convert to Islam. And think about it. Parameshvara himself had been willing to cozy up to China and even visit China and make obeisance to the Yongle Emperor in order to ensure Malacca's survival. Why would his son not be willing to at least superficially convert to Islam in order to ensure, the commercial success of Malacca? By converting to Islam, you plug Malacca into that, what is basically a global Muslim trade network. A very, very practical thing to do. You also get to take upon yourself the title of Shah and all of the, rich historical tradition that such a title entails. Well, whoever converted first, and whatever the reason, one thing we can say is that from the mid-1400s on, for about the next half century, Muslim Malacca, a Muslim sultanate, oversaw a sort of a Malay golden age in the region, led by this great port. The establishment of a Muslim sultanate at Malacca would have an especially significant impact, a major impact, on the wider region. Owing to Malacca's influence and its patronage of Islam and its subsequent reputation as an Islamic center of learning, the faith spread on the Malay Peninsula, as well as throughout much of the Indonesian archipelago, even up to the Philippines. Malacca was the greatest of the Muslim sultanates, the Malay Muslim sultanates, that dominated maritime Southeast Asia for several centuries before being snuffed out one by European colonialism. In Malacca's case, it was the Portuguese who had slowly but steadily worked their way around Africa to India and then to these waters in 1509. The encounter did not go well, as the Portuguese mission sent to open trade with Malacca not only failed to do that, failed to establish commercial connections, but also ended up in a Malaccan prison. Well, a second mission was dispatched, a second Portuguese mission. The goal of which was, it was threefold. First, secure the release of its compatriots, those Portuguese who'd been imprisoned the first time round. Second, get compensation for losses from that mission. But third, establish a Portuguese trade depot at Malacca, fortified, of course. Though clearly these demands were not going to be met by the Sultanate. And when they were presented, of course, they were rejected. And so Afonso de Albuquerque attacked Malacca, this second mission, attacked Malacca. Now the first time he was beaten back, but then a month later he attacked again, and it was very bloody and it was very hard fought, but at the end of the day it was the Portuguese who were able to run out much of that Malay ruling class and take over as the ruling class of Malacca. And that is an appropriate way to say it. They didn't, rework society here. They basically just swapped themselves out for the old ruling class and let things sort of run as they had been before. You know, they built their fort. They built a church on the side of the old Sultan's palace, behind me actually. But otherwise they let things run as they were. And like Parameshvara, members of that old Malay ruling elite, many of them, were able to establish themselves elsewhere in the region and continue that Malay tradition of Melaka. A tradition that arguably lives on into the present as a vital thread in modern day Malay nationalism.